The sky on Krios 4 didn't just turn dark, it turned bruised, a sickly shade of violet that pulsed with the rhythmic thrum of an impending electrical apocalypse. Silas Vane didn't need the proximity sensors to tell him death was coming. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones, a static charge that made the fine hairs on his arms stand at attention. Most colonists called this world a frontier. Silas called it a graveyard for the unprepared. He wasn't unprepared. As the first jagged arc of white-hot lightning tore through the methane clouds, Silas slammed the manual override on the blast shutters. The heavy titanium-reinforced plates hissed shut, sealing him inside the cramped metallic womb of Survey Station Delta. Outside, the wind began to scream, a high-pitched metallic wail that sounded like 1,000 dying machines. Silas wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his heart hammering a steady, frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was a long-range recon scout, a man paid to endure the silence of deep space, but the sheer violence of this storm was something else entirely. The HAB unit groaned. The floor vibrated beneath his heavy boots. On the holoscreen, the atmospheric readings were off the charts, flickering in angry red warnings. If a single seal failed, the pressure differential alone would turn him into a smear on the wall before the lightning had a chance to vaporize him. He was utterly alone, 300 miles from the nearest outpost, trapped in a tin can while the heavens tried to peel it open. Hold on. Before we get into the real stuff, I want to know. What are you doing at this exact moment while hearing my voice? I love seeing your answers down below in the comments. Silas reached for his coffee, cold, bitter, and synthetic, when the secondary alarm chimed. It wasn't a weather alert. It was the airlock's external proximity sensor. Someone, or something, was standing right outside his door in the middle of a storm that could melt steel. Silas froze, his hand hovering over the ceramic mug. It was impossible. No human suit could withstand the ion discharge currently bathing the station. Then came the sound. A frantic, rhythmic thudding. Not the wind, not the debris. It was a hand, or a claw, desperately hammering against the reinforced outer hatch. Silas felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the external temperature. To open that door was madness. The pressure drop could kill him instantly, but the hammering continued, growing weaker, more desperate. He looked at the external camera feed, but the screen was a mess of static and snow. Only a faint, slender silhouette was visible through the haze, slumped against the doorframe. His conscience, a vestigial organ he thought he'd left back on Earth, flared to life. With a curse, Silas lunged for the environmental controls, diverting all power to the airlock's magnetic stabilizers. He grabbed his oxygen mask, took a deep breath, and slammed the emergency cycle button. The inner door hissed open, and the airlock began its violent process of equalizing. The outer hatch cracked open just an inch, and the roar of the storm flooded the room, a deafening cacophony of thunder and crashing rain. A figure stumbled forward, collapsing through the gap and onto the cold floor of the airlock. Silas slammed the seal shut, the magnets screaming as they fought the wind, finally locking with a heavy, definitive clack. Silence returned, save for the heavy breathing of the intruder and the hum of the scrubbers working overtime to clear the toxic gases. Silas stood back, his hand resting on the grip of his pulse welder. He watched as the figure stirred. It wasn't a human. It was an Elaran, a species known for their grace, their isolation, and their deep-seated fear of the predatory Terrans. The creature groaned, pushing herself up on slender, trembling limbs. Her bioluminescent skin was flickering a dull, dying gray. She looked up, her large, multifaceted eyes blinking away the condensation, and then she saw him. She didn't just stop. She froze, her entire body locking up in a state of pure, paralyzed terror. The silence in the airlock was thicker than the storm outside. Silas didn't move. He didn't even breathe. He knew the reputation humans had in this sector of the galaxy. Apex predators, chaotic and dangerously unpredictable. To this Elaran woman, he wasn't a savior. He was a nightmare that had just trapped her in a cage. Her breathing was ragged, a series of sharp whistling gasps that rattled in her chest. The bioluminescence along her collarbone pulsed a frantic, jagged red. the universal sign of extreme distress. Silas slowly raised his hands, palms open, the universal gesture for "I am unarmed." But to a species that communicated through light and subtle pheromones, his sudden movement was like a thunderclap. She scrambled backward, her boots slipping on the moisture-slicked floor until her spine hit the reinforced outer hatch. She looked like a trapped bird, her large, dark eyes darting around the small chamber, looking for an escape that didn't exist. The storm continued to hammer against the metal behind her, a reminder that the vacuum of the wasteland was the only other option. "Easy," Silas said, his voice low and gravelly, the sound of a man who hadn't spoken to another living soul in months. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe here." She didn't understand the words, but she recoiled at the vibration of his voice. To her, human speech sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. She let out a soft, melodic whimper, her fingers clutching at a small, glowing device strapped to her thigh, a translation matrix cracked and flickering from the ion storm. Silas took a cautious step forward. He needed to get her into the main hab unit. The airlock was cold, and the atmospheric scrubbers were struggling to pull the metallic tang of the Krios 4 storms out of the air. If she stayed here, the residual radiation would cook her organs before morning. As he moved, she let out a sharp, piercing trill, her hand darting to a concealed holster. She pulled a slender, glass-like shard, an Elaran defensive pulse blade. It hummed with a pale blue light shaking in her grip. She was terrified, exhausted and wounded, but she was still prepared to die fighting the beast of Earth. Silas stopped dead. He could have overpowered her in a heartbeat. Humans were twice as dense and significantly stronger than her fragile, low-gravity species, but that would only prove her fears right. He looked at the pulse blade, then back at her eyes. He saw more than just fear there. He saw a deep, agonizing pain. A dark, oily stain was spreading across the side of her shimmering flight suit. "You're bleeding," Silas muttered, his brow furrowing. He ignored the weapon. He turned his back on her, a move of calculated vulnerability, and walked toward the medical locker near the inner door. He could feel her eyes on his spine, the weight of the pulse blade aimed at his kidneys. Every instinct he had as a scout screamed at him not to show his back to an armed stranger. But this wasn't a tactical engagement. This was a test of humanity. He pulled out a trauma kit and a canister of regenerative spray. He set them on the deck, sliding them across the floor toward her. The plastic case skittered over the metal, stopping just inches from her trembling feet. She looked down at the kit, then up at Silas. The red pulsing of her skin slowed, shifting into a confused, muted amber. She didn't pick up the kit. Instead, she looked past him, into the warm, amber-lit interior of the habitat. She saw his discarded meal, a tattered book on the table, and a small holographic photo of a green and blue marble called Earth. It wasn't the lair of a monster, it was a home. But just as the tension seemed to ebb, the station took a direct hit. A massive bolt of localized lightning struck the external spire and the lights in the airlock flickered and died. The emergency red strobes kicked in, bathing the room in a bloody rhythmic light. The Elaran woman screamed, the sound lost in the groan of protesting metal as the primary power grid buckled. The inner door, the only thing keeping the radiation out, began to slide shut automatically as the fail-safe protocols engaged. If she didn't move now, she'd be crushed or locked in the freezing dark. Silas lunged forward not to attack, but to grab her hand and pull her into the light. As his massive, scarred hand closed around her slender wrist, she didn't strike. She simply went limp, the terror finally overriding her nervous system. Silas caught her before she hit the floor, her weight feeling like nothing more than a handful of dry leaves. He dragged her into the main room just as the heavy door slammed shut with the force of a falling guillotine. He was safe. She was safe. But as Silas looked down at the unconscious alien in his arms, he realized the real danger was just beginning, because the device on her hip finally flickered to life, and a mechanical translated voice hissed out a single sentence. "They are coming for the core. Do not let the humans find it." The words hung in the recycled air of the habitat, colder than the methane frost building up on the outer hull. "Do not let the humans find it." Silas looked down at the unconscious woman in his arms. Her skin had faded to a translucent, ghostly white, the bioluminescent pulses now nothing more than a faint, dying ember. He gently laid her on his bunk, the only soft surface in the entire metallic room, and stepped back, his mind racing faster than the storm outside. What was the core? Silas was a surveyor, a man who mapped jagged rocks and radioactive gas pockets for a paycheck. He wasn't a soldier, and he certainly wasn't a thief. But in the lawless reaches of the Cryos system, words like core usually referred to power sources that could jumpstart a dying colony or weapons that could level a city. He looked at the translation matrix on her hip. It was cracked, the screen spiderwebbed with fractures, but the voice was steady. It was a recorded distress signal, looping in the background of her consciousness. She hadn't been running to him. She had been running from something far worse, carrying a secret that made a human scout look like a minor inconvenience. Silas grabbed the medical scanner from his belt. He ran the green light over her slender torso. The readout was grim. Internal hemorrhaging, cracked ribs, and a severe reaction to the ionic radiation of the storm. If he didn't stabilize her in the next 10 minutes, she wouldn't live long enough to explain what she was carrying. He worked with the practiced, clinical efficiency of a man who had stitched his own wounds more times than he could count. He applied the regenerative spray to the deep gash on her side, watching as the synthetic foam fused with her alien biology. She flinched in her sleep, a soft, melodic moan escaping her lips. As he worked, Silas noticed something tucked into a reinforced pocket of her flight suit. It was a cylinder no larger than a flare, but it hummed with an internal vibration that vibrated right through his gloves. It felt heavy, unnaturally heavy, as if it contained the mass of a small mountain. "Is this it?" he whispered to the empty room. The moment his fingers brushed the cylinder, the station's external sensors let out a piercing, high-velocity shriek. This wasn't the rhythmic thrum of the storm. This was a targeted, high-frequency scan. Someone was pinging the station from the upper atmosphere, cutting through the electrical interference with military-grade hardware. Silas dove for the control console, his boots clattering on the deck. He pulled up the long-range thermal feed. Through the swirling purple clouds and the sheets of electrified rain, 3 silhouettes were descending. They weren't landing craft. They were atmospheric interceptors, sleek and jagged, painted in the matte black of the Orion Syndicate, the most ruthless mercenary band in the quadrant. They weren't here for a weather survey. They were hunting the girl, and they didn't care if they had to melt the entire station to get to her. Silas looked at the Elaran woman. She was starting to wake up, her eyes fluttering open, reflecting the red emergency lights of the habitat. She saw Silas standing over the console, the flickering images of the mercenary ships reflected in his visor. She saw the cylinder in his hand. Her hand shot out, grasping his forearm with surprising strength. Her bioluminescence flared a panicked, jagged purple. She didn't try to fight him this time. Instead, she looked him straight in the eyes, her expression one of pure, unadulterated pleading. "Human," she rasped, the translator struggling to keep up with her weakened voice. "Hide." The spark. "If they take it, the stars go dark." Before Silas could ask what that meant, a massive explosion rocked the station. The western support pillar buckled, and the habitat tilted at a sickening 20-degree angle. The sound was deafening, the scream of tearing metal and the roar of the storm rushing into the lower levels. The mercenaries weren't waiting for the storm to clear. They were knocking. The gravity on Krios 4 was already a nightmare, but as the station's support pillars sheared away, Silas felt his world tilt into chaos. He slammed against the primary console, the wind chill from the lower levels instantly dropping the room's temperature by 20 degrees. Sirens wailed, a discordant, screaming symphony of mechanical failure. "Hold on!" Silas roared, lunging across the tilting floor to catch the Elaran woman before she slid into the sparking machinery of the environmental processors. He pinned her against the bulkhead, his massive frame shielding her from a shower of crystalline shards as the overhead lights shattered. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and burning insulation. Through the jagged rent in the lower hull, he could see the storm, a swirling vortex of violet lightning and black dust. and the glowing thrusters of the mercenary interceptors hovering like vultures above a dying beast. The Elaran woman, whose name tag he finally noticed read Leora, clutched the cylinder to her chest. Her skin was pulsing a rapid, terrified indigo. She looked at the breach in the floor, then at Silas. In her eyes, he didn't see a predator anymore. He saw the only barrier between her and the void. They will not stop, she wheezed, the translator crackling through the static of the room's dying power. The spark, it is the seed of a sun. My people. We were moving it to the dead sectors, to bring life. Silas gritted his teeth, his hand finding the grip of his heavy-duty plasma cutter. Well, right now it's bringing nothing but trouble. Can you walk? Leora tried to stand, but her legs buckled. The radiation and the crash had taken their toll. Silas didn't hesitate. He scooped her up, slinging her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. He grabbed a survival pack, shoved the spark into a lead-lined compartment, and kicked open the emergency floor hatch that led to the maintenance tunnels. We have to move, he muttered. The Syndicate doesn't do rescue missions. They'll vent this entire hab just to sift through the ashes. As they dropped into the narrow, lightless crawl space, a heavy thud vibrated through the ceiling. Boots. Magnetic, heavy-treaded boots. The mercenaries had boarded. Silas could hear the muffled, rhythmic clank of armored soldiers moving through the ruins of his home. He moved through the darkness of the tunnels with the instinct of a man who had memorized every bolt of this station. The air here was thin and tasted of rust. Leora was a dead weight on his shoulder, her breathing shallow and rhythmic. He reached the secondary airlock, the one used for rover deployment, and paused. If he took the rover, they'd see him on thermal in seconds. If he stayed, they were cornered. Suddenly, the ceiling of the maintenance tunnel exploded. A thermal charge tore through the metal, showering Silas in sparks. A mercenary in sleek, pressurized power armor dropped through the hole. His faceplate a cold, uncaring slab of black glass. He leveled a high-frequency disruptor at Silas's chest. Hand over the Elaran and the core, Terran. The mercenary's voice was synthesized, robotic. And maybe we'll let you die in the storm instead of inside a vacuum chamber. Silas looked at the barrel of the gun. He looked at Leora, who was staring up at the mercenary with a look of resigned horror. The vacuum of the lower maintenance bay roared like a wounded beast. When Silas slammed that lever, he wasn't just opening a door. He was triggering a pressurized atmospheric vent. The mercenary, caught off guard by the sheer recklessness of the move, was sucked backward as the air screamed out of the compartment. He clawed at the jagged metal of the floor, his magnetic boots sparking as they failed to find a grip in the hurricane-force decompression. Silas, however, had his arm hooked through a heavy-duty structural brace. He held onto Leora with a grip that threatened to bruise her, his muscles screaming under the strain. With a final metallic screech, the mercenary was yanked into the violet abyss of the Krios 4 storm, his silhouette vanishing into the lightning in a heartbeat. "Hold your breath," Silas bellowed, though he knew she couldn't hear him over the gale. He slammed the emergency seal, the heavy circular hatch spinning shut and locking with a pneumatic hiss. Silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the frantic thumping of his own heart. They were in the rover bay now, a cold, oil-smelling cavern filled with the skeletal frames of half-disassembled survey vehicles. Leora slumped against the wall, her bioluminescence a flickering, dying amber. She looked at Silas, her large eyes wide with a mix of awe and pure, unadulterated terror. To her, humans were supposed to be logical if brutal. She had never seen one court death so casually just to win a momentary advantage. You are insane," the translator hissed, the mechanical voice sounding almost impressed. "I'm a freelancer, Leora," Silas gasped, checking the charge on his plasma cutter. "Insanity is in the job description. Now get in the rover. We have about 30 seconds before the rest of his squad realizes their buddy just took a one-way trip to the Highlands." He practically threw her into the passenger seat of the Sandcat, a rugged, six-wheeled beast of a vehicle designed to chew through crystalline dunes. He jammed the ignition and the fusion plant roared to life with a low-frequency growl that vibrated in his teeth. But as the garage doors began to grind open, A heavy thud echoed from the roof of the rover. Then another, and another. The mercenaries weren't just in the station. They were on it. A high-powered laser began to dance across the reinforced windshield of the rover, heating the glass to a glowing cherry red in seconds. They were trying to melt their way in. Silas didn't wait for the garage doors to fully open. He slammed the rover into gear and floored the accelerator. The Sandcat lurched forward, its massive tires tearing chunks out of the metal deck. They smashed through the half-open doors, plummeting 15 feet down onto the jagged frozen surface of the planet. The suspension groaned, the impact jarring Silas's spine, but the wheels held. "Hang on!" Silas yelled as he cut the external lights. He plunged the rover into the heart of the electrical storm, driving blind through a world of swirling purple dust and lethal ion bolts. Behind them, the station exploded into a fireball as the mercenaries triggered a final, spiteful demolition. The rearview camera showed 2 sets of glowing red thrusters emerging from the smoke. The interceptors were coming, and in the open desert, there was nowhere to hide. Leora pulled the spark from the survival pack. It was glowing brighter now, pulsing in sync with the lightning strikes hitting the ground around them. "They can track the energy signature," she whispered, her voice trembling. "As long as I have the spark, we are a beacon in the dark." Silas looked at the glowing cylinder, then at the radar screen showing the mercenaries closing the gap. A grim smile spread across his face. "Then let's give them something worth tracking." The Sandcat hit a crystalline ridge, catching air for a terrifying second before slamming back onto the jagged obsidian flats. Silas gripped the steering yoke so hard his knuckles turned white. Behind them, the mercenary interceptors were no longer just tracking, they were firing. Twin streaks of ionized plasma boiled the atmosphere, missing the rover's rear bumper by mere inches and turning the ground into molten glass. "Silas!" Leora screamed, the translator barely audible over the roar of the rover's overtaxed engine. "The spark! It's reacting! The storm is feeding it!" He glanced sideways. The cylinder wasn't just glowing anymore. It was vibrating with a frequency that made the very air in the cabin hum. Arcs of miniature white lightning were dancing across its surface, leaping toward the metal dashboard. They were carrying a miniature star in a box, and the electrical fury of Krios 4 was trying to crack it open. "We can't outrun them in the open," Silas growled, his eyes darting to the topographical map flickering on his HUD. "And we can't hide with that thing acting like a flare. We need to go where they can't follow." He jerked the yoke hard to the left, sending the rover into a controlled skid toward the Shatter Canyons, a labyrinth of narrow, unstable basalt pillars that were notorious for collapsing under the slightest sonic vibration. It was a death trap for anything larger than a scout bike, and the mercenary interceptors were wide-winged atmospheric craft. "If we go in there, the stone will mask the spark's signature," Silas explained, his voice dropping into a deadly calm. "But the ceiling might come down on our heads." Leora looked at the terrifying stone spires looming ahead like the teeth of a giant. Then she looked at the mercenary ships closing the distance. She reached out, placing her slender, 3-fingered hand over Silas's scarred fist on the gear shift. Her skin pulsed a steady, determined gold. "Do it," she whispered. "Better to be buried by the world than caged by the Syndicate." Silas didn't hesitate. He slammed the rover into its highest torque setting and plunged into the shadows of the canyon. The walls were so narrow the side mirrors were sheared off instantly in a spray of sparks. Above them, the mercenary pilots realized the trap. They slowed, their thrusters kicking up massive clouds of dust as they tried to navigate the tight corridor. One pilot, more arrogant than the rest, tilted his craft sideways, trying to line up a shot through the narrow gap. "That's it. Come a little closer," Silas muttered, his thumb hovering over the rover's rear sonic pulse emitter, a tool usually used for breaking up rock blockages. He waited until the interceptor's nose was practically scraping the canyon rim. Then he triggered the pulse. A massive wave of low-frequency sound exploded from the back of the Sandcat. It didn't hit the ship. It hit the unstable, overhanging basalt pillars directly above the mercenary. For a heartbeat, there was a sickening silence. Then, the entire canyon wall groaned and detached. Thousands of tons of black rock cascaded down in a deafening roar. The mercenary pilot didn't even have time to scream before his ship was crushed into the canyon floor, disappearing under a mountain of rubble. The shockwave sent the rover fishtailing, nearly flipping it over as the ground buckled. Silas fought the wheel, flooring it as the dust cloud swallowed them whole. They burst out the other side of the canyon, battered and smoking, but alone. The second interceptor had pulled up, circling the collapse in a futile search for its partner. But as Silas let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, the rover's engine suddenly gave a wet, metallic cough. The dashboard went dark. The fusion plant, choked by the massive intake of basalt dust, shuddered and died. They were stalled in the middle of a wasteland, miles from anywhere, with the storm still raging and a second mercenary ship circling overhead like a shark that had just smelled blood. Silas looked at Leora. The spark in her lap was now blindingly bright, casting long, distorted shadows against the cabin walls. "New plan," Silas said, reaching for his heavy pulse welder and his last remaining thermal charge. We stop running. The engine's death rattle was the loneliest sound Silas had ever heard. Outside, the violet storm lashed at the hull, and above, the rhythmic thrum of the remaining Syndicate interceptor grew louder. They were sitting ducks. The mercenary pilot wasn't going to play games anymore. He was going to level the entire area and pick the spark out of the craters. Silas grabbed his heavy pulse welder and the last thermal charge. He looked at Leora. Her skin was no longer flickering. It was glowing with a constant, radiant silver, reflecting the power of the spark in her lap. "I need you to trust me," Silas said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Humans aren't just known for being dangerous. We're known for being stubborn, and I am the most stubborn man on this planet." Leora looked at the spark, then at the man who had risked everything for a stranger. She didn't see a monster. She saw a protector. "What do we do?" "We don't hide the beacon," Silas said, a fierce glint in his eyes. "We use it." Silas climbed out of the rover, the wind nearly tearing him off the ladder. He scrambled onto the roof, the electrified rain stinging his skin. He planted the thermal charge directly onto the Sandcat's communication array and wired it to the spark's containment cylinder. He wasn't building a bomb. He was building a signal amplifier. The interceptor descended, its belly cannons glowing red as they began to cycle. The pilot was aiming right for them. "Now, Leora!" Silas roared. Inside the cabin, Leora opened the spark's vent. A pillar of pure, blinding white light shot upward, channeled through the rover's array and boosted by the thermal charge. It wasn't just light. It was a concentrated burst of solar energy. The beam pierced through the purple clouds like a spear, hitting the mercenary interceptor square in its sensor array. The ship's electronics fried instantly. The cockpit glass shattered as the sheer energy of the spark overloaded its systems. The interceptor veered wildly, its engines screaming in a feedback loop before it slammed into a nearby ridge, vanishing in a spectacular orange fireball that lit up the desert for miles. As the echoes of the explosion died down, the storm began to break. The violet clouds parted, revealing a glimpse of the starlit sky. Silas collapsed back into the rover's cabin, gasping for air, his clothes singed and his hands shaking. Leora reached out, closing the spark's vent. The cabin returned to a soft, warm amber glow. She looked at Silas, her eyes shimmering with something that looked remarkably like human tears. "You saved the seed," she whispered. "You saved a future son." "I just wanted to finish my dinner," Silas joked weakly, but his smile was genuine. Months later, the story of the ghost of Delta Station would spread through the Elaran sectors. They would tell tales of the human who stood against the Syndicate, not for gold or glory, but because someone was in trouble. It was a story that changed the way the galaxy looked at Earth, not as a nest of predators, but as a home for heroes. Silas and Leora eventually reached the Elaran frontier, but that is a story for another time. For now, the Scout and the Starbearer watched the first real sunrise Krios 4 had seen in 1,000 years. If you enjoyed this journey into the depths of space and the strength of the human spirit, make sure to like this video and share it with your fellow travelers. For more epic HFY sci-fi tales that prove humanity is a force to be reckoned with, subscribe to HFY Soundscape and hit that notification bell. You don't want to miss what we have coming next. What would you have done in Silas's shoes? Let me know in the comments below.